Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Shannon Joy Show. Live, day 3 from the Christmas bunker. We've been able to cobble together the radio program and move it to my dining room. I want to welcome all of you who are joining me today for another episode, the Wednesday episode of the Shannon Joy Show. So we have Courtney right here in the dining room studio with me in the Christmas bunker, and Mike Panessa, who is my engineer, is available via the phone if anything goes wrong. So I hope nothing goes wrong. I'm trying to get to the point where I can put this in place all by myself, so I don't have to have people here with me every day. But I am just so thrilled to be with you guys. Thank you for popping onto the feed. Please share this out to everyone you know. If you could share this link on Facebook and Twitter so you can let everyone, all of our friends, I think I have about between Facebook, Twitter, friends, followers, and likes, I have about 15,000 people in the community, and a lot of them don't know where the program has gone. Additionally, here locally in Rochester, people don't know where the program has gone. So the more that you guys can help me push this out, the better. I've had a great week. I'm going to start the program by just giving you guys an update on where we are at with the radio show and where we hope to go in the next couple weeks. I'm just going to tell you, I'm not going to give you any details right now, but I have had some incredibly promising discussions, actually just one this morning that I think you guys are going to be really excited about. So I have a feeling that we're going to be able to get through this. I am looking for a new local flagship affiliate here in Rochester, New York, so that we can begin to move the entire Shannon Joy operation over to a new home. And so that's my number one priority, but I am also reaching out to national syndicators and also folks at The Blaze and CRT TV. As you know, they have recently merged together, and there are some potential opportunities there as well. So I'm really exhausting all of these resources, but what I love right now about this community is that we are beginning to build up an audience and a community starting right here on YouTube that is completely and wholly independent from any corporation, any syndication company, any broadcast company. It really is an NPR style, a public radio style operation here where you guys are my boss and I am directly responsible to you, the listener. And so if I'm bringing you news of the day that you can use, if you're getting truthful political analysis from this radio and now video program, then hopefully you'll continue to subscribe to the Shannon Joy Show, the shannonjoyshow.com, where you can get the live feed. So next week, right now we are just up at YouTube, and we just hit 300 followers. So who do we have on, Courtney? I'm going to see if I can pop on and see.
Jennifer Harris.
All right.
Zippy Crew.
Zippy Crew is with us. Hey, Zippy Crew.
Steve Noble.
Hey, Steve, how are you? I'm so glad I had such a good time. Go ahead.
A long time no see.
So thank you so much to Steve Noble, who has a syndicated radio program down south, and he was gracious enough to allow me to come on to his radio program yesterday, and we had a great time talking about my faith journey. It was nice to talk about it. It's not often that I get to spend an entire hour talking about Jesus, but that's one of my favorite topics. So we had a really fun conversation, Steve. Thank you so much for that exposure yesterday. It really helps as we begin to put together this new audience. But right now we're broadcasting exclusively from YouTube. I just launched the new YouTube channel a few days ago. We are already at 300 subscribers, which is amazing. The first threshold was 100 subscribers, which we met in less than a day. And now when we get to 400 subscribers, we can begin to monetize the YouTube station, which is kind of cool. But the point of the YouTube really isn't to be the exclusive place where I meet my audience. What we really want to use YouTube for is the ability to push this video content out through all of my social media accounts. So by next week, fingers crossed, right? By next week, I hope to be able to embed this video content into my Facebook feed and also my Twitter feed. Also, it will be embedded at the shannonjoy.com com. Once that happens, once we're able to push this out through all of those outlets, I think we're going to begin to see some real numbers, and we're going to be able to see some real growth in the online and national audience for this program. And so regardless of where I go, so if I find a new radio station and a home for my advertisers and, a place to begin to push out the radio program again, all of this will stay. So we really solidified that safety net that I had in place at the radio station I used to work with. I just had never really developed it a whole lot because I was so busy with the other radio program. But now we're able to really solidify this audience in the model. I think it's the way the model should be between a radio host and an audience, right? You guys should be my boss, not, corporate bureaucrats or corporate bankers or executives or syndicators or national platforms. This really honest relationship between a commentator, a radio host, and the audience, I think, is the most important one. And so when we have a subscriber base and a revenue stream coming directly from you, that's what allows me to tell you the truth every single day. It allows me to deliver the truth to the audience. So are there any questions? I want to start with, are there any questions or comments? Does anyone have?
Not questions yet, but the Strident Conservatives here, so David Leach.
David Leach, it's so good to have you on the stream. Welcome to YouTube. Hopefully this will be on Facebook very soon, but David has just recently put out a couple good pieces, one on the merger between the Blaze and CRTV. He has some concerns about that merger, and I have to tell you, David, I share some of your concerns about that. I think a lot of people share some of your concerns about the consolidation of conservative media, and also, at least up until this point, their unwillingness to directly attach Donald Trump to the multiple legislative disasters that have occurred over the past 2 years, namely 5 or 6 massive spending bills, omnibus, minibus 2, minibus 1, continuing resolutions, budget bill after budget bill that has been passed funding the majority of the Obama era initiatives. So everything, I have a little list here, but again, sky-high debt and deficit, something that conservative Republicans have been addressing for years, right? Screaming about the credit card to the Bank of China and how the debt and deficit is going to destroy this country and the future for our children. It will destroy our Constitution. All those things are actually true. It's just conservatives don't care about that anymore, apparently, because of the man who occupies the Oval Office, right? So they will bash Republicans. They will bash senators. They'll go after Congress, but they never attach the congressional mishaps to the presidential signature that is necessary to pass those bills, right? He should be bearing responsibility. President Trump, who has the ability to use his bully pulpit to push a legislative agenda that reflects the values of his base, his conservative base, the folks who got him elected in 2016. It is his responsibility to use every power at his disposal to push forth that legislative agenda. And we have seen throughout the past 2 years that this president not only is unwilling to use the veto power, in fact, I think this is the only president who has gone this long within his presidential term without using the veto pen, but it seems that he won't even use the bully pulpit, his massive audience on Twitter, and also his access to Fox News and conservative news to rally up the base to get them to call their legislators so that we can get bills that defund Planned Parenthood. We can get bills that take apart Common Core. We can get bills that actually repeal Obamacare. You see, it takes a village, so to speak, in Washington, D.C. You need a House, you need a Senate, and you need a presidency. And the problem that everyone identified rightly 2.5 years ago was that the House and the Senate, the leadership, Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan, and the leadership of both of those houses refused to push a conservative agenda. The reason that so many American conservatives voted for Donald Trump was because he promised to go in and break those houses. He promised to go in and take on the swamp. The swamp equals Mitch McConnell. The swamp equals Lindsey Graham. The swamp equals leadership in the House. But Donald Trump, time and time again, when he had the opportunity to align with Ted Cruz or Mike Lee or Rand Paul, he shoved that aside. When he had the opportunity to align with the Freedom Caucus or the Liberty Caucus in the House and push through true conservative legislative agendas, he decided to align with Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and Paul Ryan. That was a choice by this president that he needs to be held accountable for. And at this point, there are so few voices in conservative media who are willing to call him out on that. The reason it's important to call him out is because he needs to feel the pain when he betrays his base and his constituency. And so I applaud David Leitch for continuing to hold the line. Two really good pieces on the destruction of the conservative movement and namely conservative media at the hands of this president. I want to thank you for joining us. But this is what, we're going to talk about criminal justice reform in the second half hour of this program. But first, we're going to talk about the legislative stocking full of coal that the Republicans are going to deliver to us in and around December 21st of 2018. So apparently, George H.W. Bush, an elderly man, passes away, and he goes off to meet his maker. And apparently in Washington, D.C., there is such weeping and gnashing of teeth that they just can't legislate anymore. They're so distraught. Apparently Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan and the leadership, Republicans are so torn up about the passing of George W. Bush that they simply cannot legislate. Sorry, guys. They can't come to work. They can't debate bills. They can't write legislation, look at legislation. Apparently everything has to shut down in Washington, D.C. because of the passing of George H.W. Bush. Well, that's a likely excuse, and it's a bogus excuse, and you all know that, and I know that, and they know that. This is yet another tactic by the leadership, the unibrow, right, the leadership in the Republican Party who align with the Democrat progressives in Washington, D.C. to push this off till the last week before Christmas so that you guys will not get wind of what they're doing. And so I have a piece from Daniel Horowitz. First of all, yesterday we mentioned that as far as the stocking full of coal, legislative coal that we're going to get in the last week before Christmas, we've mentioned a couple major initiatives yesterday. So number one, we're going to get a massive spending bill. It was supposed to be debated this week on Thursday, but instead they're going to pass a continuing resolution because, again, of the weeping and gnashing of teeth regarding the passing of George H.W. Bush. They're just too upset. They can't legislate because of the untimely death of George W. Bush. So they are going to pass a continuing resolution this week. They're going to avoid any scrutiny and any debate. In fact, you won't even know how anyone voted because it's going to be a closed vote. And that was revealed by Daniel Horowitz in his latest piece of conservative review that I'm going to reference to in a minute. But yesterday I did tell you, number one, a massive funding bill. It's going to fund the government. So we will continue, and we're talking about the stocking full of legislative coal that we're about to get. Sky-high debt, sky-high deficits as far as the eye can see. They are going to fund Obamacare. They are going to fund DACA. They are going to fund refugee resettlement. They are going to fund Planned Parenthood. They are going to fund the ABC soup of legislative agencies that conservatives used to complain about back in the day, like the EPA and OSHA and the Department of Education and the unconstitutional spying agency, the NSA. They're going to fund all of the FISA courts. In fact, you know what Trump is going to fund in this new round of budget battles? He's going to fund his own investigation by Robert Mueller, right? So this is how crazy all of this gets, right? These investigations that are unconstitutional and they're all so terrible and everyone's so mad about on the Republican side, once again, they're not doing anything to take care of those agencies. In addition, they are going to continue to fund and support the massive tangle of courts, the federal courts across the country that could be addressed by the constitutional powers that are reserved for Congress to create courts and also to take power from courts. And this is something that Daniel Horowitz has also pointed out in many articles, that there is much power within Congress to rein in these out of control courts that are taking apart some of the only good executive orders and policy initiatives that President Trump has put forward, namely, halting or controlling the refugee influx into this country, in addition to some of the reforms in the military regarding transgenders, right? All of that is still in place. We have executive orders that were put in place by Donald Trump, but they are all tangled up and caught up in the federal court system by self-appointed judge kings. Now, this could be addressed if Congress would work with President Trump to, for example, reduce the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to a parking court or a traffic court. They have the power to do that. I don't have the section right here with me, but it is constitutional. Yet you don't see Trump pushing for that. You don't see the Republicans pushing for that. Instead, they're going to continue to fund it, business as usual, in Washington, D.C. They are going to continue to fund Common Core. They are going to continue to fund the insurance subsidies that were put in place by President Obama in Obamacare. They are going to continue to fund the outrageous wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Middle East, right? And in fact, President Trump has indicated he has been increasing funding for the war in Afghanistan. This was a specific promise that was put in place by President Trump during the election that not only did he not make good on, but he's also doubling down on, unfortunately, the policies of Barack Obama. So this is the legislative stocking full of coal that we are going to get at probably, I'm guessing, Courtney, it will be December 24th, maybe 11:45 or 12:45 at night, right? It's going to be right on Christmas Eve, aka, or Nancy Pelosi. You'll have to read the bills to find out, or we'll have to pass the bills in order to find out what is in the bill. So first and foremost, massive spending bill. This is nothing new. We have been reporting on these types of spending bills now for 2 years. So that is on the docket. In addition, we have a massive criminal justice reform bill that we're going to get into a little more deeply today at the bottom of the hour in the second half of the video podcast. And I have a lot of information here for you. We're going to try to break down criminal justice reform so that you understand it. There is so much disinformation out there right now regarding that issue. Again, that will probably be attached in some way to the package of legislation that the turncoat backstabbers in Washington, D.C. are going to shove down our throats on Christmas Eve, okay? So we have the funding bill, we have the criminal justice reform bill. In addition, we have, and I mentioned this yesterday, that Lindsey Graham is working very hard behind the scenes to attach a DACA fix. Now, deferred action for deferred action for, I'm blanking, but the DACA was essentially for young illegal immigrants who came over here with their parents. It was no fault of their own. They've been living here for so many years, blah, blah, blah. These are all the same arguments that we were treated to during the Gang of Eight battle. But the difference between the Gang of Eight battle is that we had a focused and engaged conservative media that was on a daily basis informing their audience and mobilizing the base to fight it, right? In this scenario, we have Lindsey Graham working with his unibrow partners in Washington, D.C. to create a DACA fix, essentially the same thing that we saw in the Gang of Eight Amnesty bill, but we don't have an engaged media. We do not have a conservative media at this point that is willing to fight it. So, unfortunately, like so many other issues, we are getting the worst of Democrat policy initiatives, the worst of Democrat-style spending bills and legislative agendas, and we're stamping it with the Republican brand. And the conservatives are nowhere to be found. You won't hear about this on Fox News. You will not hear about this on Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity or so many of the conservative media outlets in the U.S. today. In fact, my radio program, Daniel Horowitz, Steve Dace, there are just a handful of us across the nation who are continuing to link these policy initiatives to this president. And that's the fair thing to do. We would criticize, the first few years of my radio program, President Obama was in office, and we criticized him every day about the exact same legislative agendas. The only difference today in anything that I'm doing is that there is a different president, but the policies are the same. They continue to be the same. And so I mentioned Lindsey Graham. This was from the Washington Examiner just a couple weeks ago. Senator Lindsey Graham said Sunday, and this was from late November, that Republican leaders should attach to the year-end government funding bill a fix to the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. Graham was breaking from GOP leadership, saying that any effort to fix DACA would come, they were saying that any effort to fix DACA would come after or separately from a funding bill. But Graham is saying, no, we got to put those together. And this is how they shove it through, right? They threaten a government shutdown. They threaten, with all of the talking points, you're not going to get your Social Security check. We're not going to be able to pay for our national security, which are all lies. But this is how they can attach a major amnesty bill. Graham said on CNN, the State of the Union just a couple weeks ago, everyone believes we need more border security. Most people believe we need to go from chain migration, family-based immigration, to merit-based immigration. And most want to give the DREAM Act kids a more certain life. Let's do it in December for good, for the country, and let's take care of a lot of problems at one time, right? So you got to bundle it all together. That's how you know it's going to be bad, and show the country that we can actually function. I'm really excited about the possibilities of legislating for amnesty. This is from Lindsey Graham in December. He's teaming up with Senator Dick Durbin. Again, there's your example of the unibrow. And remember, Lindsey Graham now is the poster child for the conservative pundit. He is Donald Trump's best friend. Conservatives love him. I think Sean Hannity has Lindsey Graham on his program every other week, right? Because he's the new face of conservatism. So there is a lot of goodwill in Washington, D.C. between Donald Trump and Lindsey Graham, and this goes back to his statements in robust support of I think it was in the Kavanaugh situation. That's where Lindsey Graham has now morphed from a swampy rhino Republican to the new media darling of the conservative media. Courtney, do we have any comments, questions? I'd love to get some of your feedback as we work through the show.
Dennis said that Graham pushes this when he isn't trying to start a war somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Donna says that Graham pushes amnesty when he isn't trying to start a war somewhere, which is quite true.
Let's see. $1 trillion deficit will seem like chicken feed. Again.
Yeah, so we've been reporting for quite some time that we are approaching, it's not even $1 trillion deficits. I mean, we're looking at hundreds of trillions of dollars in unfunded liabilities. And it's just as far as the eye can see. And right before we were terminated at the radio station that I used to work for, I was having some really important discussions. We did multiple programs on the radio program about the true state of this economy. And the economy, if you listen to conservative media, you will think it is robust. The stock market is doing better than ever. It's, according to Donald Trump, the best economy in the history of the world, and the numbers just don't bear that out. And so I want to encourage all of you who are watching today, if you want to go back and look at some of my shows, go to theshannonjoy.com and subscribe. You can subscribe for $2.99 a month for all of the podcasts, so you can listen on demand and commercial free. But you can also search by topic. And my two recent interviews with John O'Donnell from the Online Trading Academy were really, really interesting and enlightening to me. I'm learning so much. We basically did a Money 101, and we talked about the true and honest state of this economy. And so many economists, from Jesse Colombo to John O'Donnell, folks at the Online Trading Academy. Also, I really like Peter Schiff, who has written some great books on the economy. These are all Austrian, from the Austrian School of Economics. And they are looking at the debt and deficit. If you're wondering why this economy isn't taking off like gangbusters, it's because there's an albatross around our neck, and the albatross is the debt and deficit. In fact, a lot of the numbers that you're seeing coming out that are really good in terms of the economy are because of government spending. For example, recently, we had some good economic numbers, GDP numbers, the good GDP growth numbers, but much of that GDP growth was attributed to government spending for disaster relief across the country. And so this is not sustainable. It's not a sustainable model. As conservatives, we know this. We've been saying this now for decades. The only difference today is that there is a Republican in the White House. And because of that, because of the factions in this country, and the fact that we tend to, as conservatives, just defend people because they have an R behind their name, this is what is allowing us to accept these disastrous progressive policies.
The Zippy crew said, in quotes, reform always equals bad for us.
Reform always equals bad for us, and that's from Zippy, and I agree with you. Anytime they are reforming, and listen, we're going to get into this today, but we're going to go through the structure of how they reform. They usually work 10 years out, at least 5 years out, and it is always bipartisan. And so today we're going to look at the criminal justice reform that is being shoved down our throats, and we're going to compare it to Common Core. Because I'm an expert in Common Core. We studied it, hundreds of hours of study and research on education in the U.S. And I can tell you the initiatives that they're putting in place and the tactics and techniques that they're using right now to push through criminal justice reform, which is Common Core for cops, right? It has nothing to do with feeling sorry for prisoners. It has nothing to do with the cost of the prison system. It has nothing to do with legalizing marijuana. It has nothing to do with any of you, any benefit to any American. The whole point of criminal justice reform is to control local police departments and local sheriff's departments. In the same way, the only point of No Child Left Behind in Common Core was to thwart and undermine the locally elected public school board. That was the only mission. And that is a direct assault on our representative democracy. It is a direct assault on our liberty, and it is a direct assault on our local government. And this is why I encourage people to begin to rise up from the bottom up, from local government, because that's going to be the frontline battle. We're going to need people who are in elected positions at both the local and state level who understand their constitution and understand the nature of this battle, because this is where you're going to have to resist and say no. Do we have any other questions, Courtney?
Not questions, just comments.
Okay. Any good comments? I'm trying to pull it up here on my phone, but I can't.
Dennis said the press is spinning the economy so they can smear Trump when it crashes.
Yep. Well, and that, yeah, we know that we're going to have turmoil. In the past month, I mean, the Dow has been down significantly and consistently. We've wiped out all of 2018 gains in less than 2 months. And this is just the beginning. So make sure that you keep your dial tuned here on YouTube for the program, because as I begin to get my sea legs, it's a little weird. I haven't even paid attention to politics for a week. Last week was so crazy that I really haven't even been paying attention. But as I begin to get more comfortable with the format of this program and the style in which we use to push out information, we're going to be taking a hard look at the economy. And hopefully by next week, fingers crossed, we will be set up to take on guests and callers. So I really would love to have that interaction with you guys on the phone lines. And I also am excited to feature some of the great guests that we were able to bring you over the past 5.5 years from the radio station that I used to work for, or that I used to work with, that I don't work with anymore. Any comments, Courtney?
Yes, we have a question.
Sure.
The Zippy crew said, is my kid's Christian school truly safe from Common Core? They don't take government funding.
Your school is not safe from Common Core, and I'm going to use New York State as an example. This is something that I was going to report on the show last week, but private schools in New York State received a letter just a couple weeks ago from the Commissioner of Education, Mary Ellen Aaliyah, here in New York State. And I want you all to remember, in my national audience, so goes New York State, so goes the rest of the country. They take what happens in New York State and in California and they mirror it with national legislation. So you guys have to be ready for this. Our private school received a letter from the Commissioner of Education saying that in the interest of equity, right, because they need to make sure that every child gets an equitable education, that they are going to be instituting new policies, new procedures, and new standards on private schools. My son's private Christian school takes absolutely no funding from the federal government or even the state government. The only type of funding that they take is through busing, if you were to consider that to be funding, and I think some athletic agreements for some of the athletic programs. And so this has private schools very concerned, homeschool defense funds very concerned here in New York State. Unless we begin to resist the control at the local level, public schools, charter schools, private schools, they will not stop. That's the problem. You see, a lot of Christian conservatives, because they have removed their kids from public schools and ensconced them safely in a private school or in a homeschool, they thought 5 years ago that they didn't need to engage in the Common Core battle because that's just the public school. Well, number one, that's a bad idea because there are millions of students going to public schools and becoming indoctrinated to socialism and globalism on a daily basis. They are building an army in public schools. And this is why, even if your kids aren't in a public school, you need to engage, right? But in addition, they will not stop. You will not see them stop at public schools. They have already taken over every charter school. So back in the early days of the Common Core battle, I had all sorts of friends throughout the country who got very excited about charter schools. Well, look, we hate Common Core, but look what's going to happen. We can have these private corporations and we can have these charter schools and it's going to be wonderful. And I told you all 3.5 years ago, listen, you have to read the text of the legislation. A charter school cannot function in any state or any municipality in the United States of America without complying with the federal standards. Namely, they have to comply, they have to have a 95% participation rate of students taking the Common Core exams. And we know that the Common Core exams drive the curriculum. If the charter school students fail or do not perform on the Common Core exams, the federal government can shut them down in 24 hours. That's what makes charters so dangerous, because their funding is directly tethered to the federal government. It's different with a public school. A public school gets 80 to 90% of their funding, in some cases, directly from property taxes and taxpayers in their local municipality. This is why the feds, they want that money. They want control of those local tax dollars. And so the charter schools are not funded by your local property taxes. They get their funding directly from the state and federal governments. And so the state or the feds can shut them down literally in 24 hours. And it's happened here in New York State multiple times, namely within the Buffalo City School District. And we detailed that many years ago. And so every single charter school, 100% of charter schools in the United States of America are Common Core compliant, meaning that they comply with the federal ESSA standards. The kids have to take the Common Core exams. They have to provide the approved curriculum. They have to implement the data collection techniques. And there are a couple other, the assessments and all of the surveillance and data that come along with agreeing to implement the Common Core standards. So private schools at this point can still wiggle out of the Common Core standards, but there's another problem. The other problem is that in 2005, the last non-Common Core textbook that was produced was in 2005. Maybe it was 2008. It's either I think it's actually 2008. And so because I've told you all the planners work out very far in advance, 10 years in advance. And so they knew that these changes, the Common Core standards, the curriculum, that was all put in place before you ever even heard about it. The textbook companies, the big ones like Pearson and McGraw-Hill and these massive, I mean, these are huge corporations, global corporations. They were changing all of their textbooks, all of their materials, all of their worksheets, all of their workbooks. Everything was aligning to Common Core before Common Core ever even came into awareness in this country, before legislation was ever passed. And so if your private school is using any textbooks that have been created or prepared after 2008, those textbooks and those materials are aligned with Common Core. Unless they can find a textbook manufacturer or a curriculum that is absolutely 100% Common Core free, then most likely it is a Common Core curriculum. In my son's Christian private school, they bring home their textbooks, and Common Core is stamped all over them, right? And that's in a private Christian school. So you have to be very diligent. There are, Duke Pesta has a great classical curriculum that is absolutely free of Common Core. That's one of the only curriculums that I know of in the country. If you want to go to, what is his, Freedom Project Academy? Courtney, if you can help me find Duke Pesta's website.
Got it.
And I'll give that out as a link. But to answer your question, no one is safe from Common Core. This is why we need to restart the righteous indignation and the activation of moms and dads and grandparents and activists across the country, because Common Core is worse than ever under Donald Trump, under Betsy DeVos, and under the Republican Party. And that's unfortunate. I don't like to bring that news to people, but that is the case. So we're talking about the legislative stocking full of coal that we're going to get on and about December 24th, right? Christmas Eve is when those busy little elves in Washington, D.C. deliver our presents. And number one, we're going to get a horrible spending bill. Number two, we're going to potentially get a massive amnesty snuck in there, a DACA fix, which is another way of saying we're going to legalize millions upon millions upon millions of illegal immigrants. And by the way, Republicans are going to cheer this because Donald Trump is going to sign it. So that's the second component. The third component is criminal justice reform, which is where I want to direct the program at this point. Courtney, do we have any questions? Do we have any comments that need to be adjusted?
I just dropped the Freedom Project Academy's website in the comments.
Oh, awesome. So Freedom Project Academy, it is Duke Pesta's online curriculum. It is a classical curriculum, and it's excellent. That's one of the only ones. And so if you want to bring that to your private school, I would urge and activate all private school parents to begin to become incredibly vigilant, because they are coming after private schools, and they're coming fast. So criminal justice reform, we began to talk about it yesterday in the program. And some of the best reporting that you're going to get is from Conservative Review and Daniel Horowitz. There are two pieces that he released yesterday. Number one, yes, the prison reform bill lets out high-risk inmates and sex offenders. And he goes through this piece and lays out, using the legislation, he lays out the scenario that would allow high-risk inmates and also sex offenders to go free and have their sentences commuted. Now, the proponents of Jailbreak, aka criminal justice reform, people like Mike Lee and Van Jones and George Soros and the Koch brothers, they are saying that all of these claims about early release for violent felons are false. And they're walking that back now because they're being caught in the lie. But Daniel Horowitz in this piece lays out how when they talk about reducing sentences, when they say that they're not getting early release, right? So Mike Lee will say, oh, we're not going to release them early. He's not including home confinement, halfway houses, or supervised release, right? Which is a nightmare for local law enforcement agencies. We have nightmare scenarios of inmates who are released to home confinement or halfway houses and going out and committing heinous crimes. Also on parole, even supervised release. And so when they tell you that these felons are not being released, they're not including these major categories, which I think is disingenuous, to be honest. But in addition, Daniel has a piece. This is who the criminal justice reform advocates want released into our streets. And so we're going to reference these two articles in a minute, but I want to quickly turn your attention. Yesterday we began to look at how criminal justice reform is not something new. In the same way that Common Core, when we were battling it, it was new to all of us. We had never heard of it before. But in reality, they had been planning and plotting and scheming for 10 years prior to Common Core ever becoming a well-known entity in the U.S. And in the same way, criminal justice reform is being rolled out in a similar fashion. And so I want to go back to the piece that we used yesterday. This was from 2014. So here we are, 2019, or almost 2019, almost 5 years later. And this is a press release from the ACLU regarding a grant in the amount of $500 million from George Soros to the American Civil Liberties Union in support of a nationwide campaign to end mass incarceration. And the mindset behind the liberals is that incarceration in and of itself is unconstitutional and inhumane, and that the people in prisons are actually the victims, right? Not the people who were subjected to the rape or the murder or the assault or the theft. Those people, those victims who have been abused by some of these criminals, no, they're not the victims. It's actually the criminal themselves because of inequality, right? There's an equity problem in the U.S. And because everyone in the U.S. does not have the same exact amount of money, the same exact type of housing, because we do not all have cookie cutter experiences in this country in terms of education, family life, income, etc. Because of those inequalities, these people who are in prison are really, they just weren't given the same shots that other people were given. And so they are actually victims. And this is the mindset on the left regarding criminal justice reform. They would probably, in my estimation, like to, and this goes back to the reform. Remember, we've always had these debates between Democrats and Republicans about reforming criminals. And Republicans would say, listen, the point of the criminal justice system in prisons is not to reform anyone. It is to protect the general society, regular people, the 90% of Americans who are law-abiding, they pay their taxes, they don't commit crimes. The point of all of this is to protect them, not to spend an inordinate amount of time and resource to protect those who are actually committing the crimes. But this was a $50 million grant from George Soros to the ACLU in 2014. Again, they were planning this many, many years before you ever even heard of it, before you ever heard of the First Step Act, which is what is being debated now on Capitol Hill. But I want to go in a little bit deeper and tell you how what does that money go to do, right? It's not a $50 million ad campaign. It's not as if George Soros says, hey, let's buy, 1,000 billboards and, millions of GRPs on radio stations and TV stations across the country to promote criminal justice reform. That's not where that $50 million goes. And I'm going to tell you where it goes so that you guys can begin to understand how they scheme to do this and the tactics and the techniques that they used. Specifically, in accepting the grant from the Open Society Foundation, that's George Soros's grant arm, outlined immediate next steps that the ACLU will have to take. So in order to get the money, ACLU has to do certain things. And this is what they began doing 5 years ago. Again, before you ever heard of the First Step Act. Number one, bring transparency to the current crisis by assembling and disclosing state and local data around who is behind bars for how long, and for what offense. So it always starts with research. They need data. You always hear politicians and bureaucrats talking now about data-based decision making, right? Fact-based decision making. So the first step in preparing the society for a terrible bill that destroys our Constitution, our local government, and our civil liberties, the first step is to create data at the local and state level that will put forth their agenda, right? They need to be able to go to lawmakers and say, well, look at this. There is so much disparity in the prison system, and it's people of this race or this ethnicity or this income level or this color, and that is so unfair. But they need all that data. The data isn't collected in order to try to learn something. The data is collected and disseminated in order to achieve a predetermined political outcome. Okay, so that's the first step. $50 million to begin to collect data and provide a case to state, local, and federal lawmakers for criminal justice reform. Number 2, select 3 to 5 key states for 2016 action. Those with the largest prison populations, most egregious sentencing, and a history of playing consequential roles in the election of the next president. So they go and they find test states. And one of the best examples of the test state is found, and we covered this on my radio program. You guys can probably look it up on theshannonjoy.com. It was a Utah. This was a bill, a sweeping criminal justice bill that was passed in Utah. And I have it here somewhere in all of my stuff. Oh, here it is. Okay. All right. So this was from 2015. And this is from the Desert News, which is a Utah publication. Bill would make, quote, epic shift in Utah's criminal justice system. Salt Lake City, Representative Eric Hutchings, Republican of Kearns County, said his criminal justice reform bill introduced Wednesday it will result in what he said is an epic shift and how the state treats offenders. Now, this is not just a Utah thing. Some people wonder why Mike Lee is promoting jailbreak and criminal justice reform. This is not just a Utah thing, but I think that plays into Mike Lee's decision-making here. He's been sold a bill of goods. But we reported on this bill. This Utah bill has nothing to do really with making life easier for the general public or being more fair to criminals. It read like a Common Core piece of legislation. It essentially put in, and I read the legislation back in 2015 when it was passed. Essentially, it overhauled the criminal justice system and it made all of the local law enforcement agencies, the sheriff departments, comply to a standard set of sentencing guidelines and initiatives. So it essentially took the power away from the Utah's local police department and put it in the hands of the state. That's step number 1. You take the power from the locals, you put it into the hands of the state. Then the federal government comes in and takes over the state. And the states then say, oh, we have to comply with the federal government. This is the exact way that they got Common Core in. First, they compiled it. Common Core actually started with, so criminal justice reform here in the U.S. started with the Koch brothers and George Soros, and probably close to $100 million in grant funding almost 10 years ago. Common Core in the same way started in the United States of America by, again, two seemingly opposite benefactors. It was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation who pumped in millions upon millions of dollars to the Common Core initiative, aligning with, guess who? The Bush Family Foundation and Jeb Bush's organization. So they started 10 years before Common Core ever came around. They were the ones that paid for all the data, and they needed data. They needed to say, oh, the American schools are failing, and that's why we need to take it over, and we need standards, and the federal government needs to be in control. That was essentially what happened with Common Core. So it starts with the mega funders who operate as NGOs. I mean, they're business people, but really they're political in nature. The major funders, they gather up all the data, and then you have a couple key states that roll out the initiative first. And in the case of criminal justice reform, it was it was Utah, and the bill was SB 348 that people criticize as being soft on crime, but really this is the template bill. And so any of you out there who are my researchers, especially if you are well-versed in Common Core and how Common Core came to be, pull up HB 348 in Utah and read it. It reads like a Common Core bill, right? Massive amounts of data collection, massive amounts of surveillance, and standards upon standards upon standards, right? That every police department and sheriff's department must comply with. This is why I call criminal justice reform Common Core for cops. And I was just, I just got a letter. I'm on an email chain with major sheriff's associations in the U.S., and they are beginning to wake up to this scam, and they're beginning to realize they're talking about in the First Step Act, some of the provisions are going to be impossible for local sheriff's departments and police departments to comply with. It's all unfunded, and they have a laundry list of the most ridiculous standards that the sheriff's departments are going to have to comply with. This is why, and I'm not ready to disclose yet who these people are, but essentially from a very, very trusted source, and this is what he sent to me today. Shannon, I haven't had time to delve through the ancillary provisions of the bill, but there is an entire section I haven't written on that is literally Common Core for sheriffs. And this is coming from one of this is a very reliable source. He said it's a laundry list of standards and procedures on how to confine juveniles. And essentially, it sounds nice, but it's dangerous and an unfunded liability for local law enforcement. This is why the sheriff's associations and the sheriff's unions are getting anxious about this bill. They're saying there's no way that we can comply with this, number one, and it's also dangerous. So for example, you can't confine a juvenile in a room by himself for more than 3 minutes it's very detailed, and this is all federal, right? How on earth could Mike Lee, who believes in power of the states, power of local jurisdictions, how on earth could he support basically the federal takeover of the prison system, the sheriff's department, and your local police department? That's what this is all about. Everything else they're telling you is a lie. Courtney, do you have any questions, or do we have people popping on?
I have a couple questions and a comment. Todd said, I work in the jail. People are stabbing each other and attacking us. There's not much that will change these guys. Not saying everyone is lost, but there's a lot.
Yeah, this is the age-old question about taking a prison population or people who have been imprisoned and reforming them, right? If you just give them good enough therapy and they do enough yoga and meditation and they take these training courses, and that's really what First Step Act is all about. Essentially, it's saying, listen, these guys are nonviolent. Number one, that's fake and that's false, and we've debunked that. Most of these people who are eligible for commuted sentence or reduced sentence are violent criminals. The only reason that they are convicted under drug trafficking or guns or weapons charges is because we've already made it so difficult to prosecute murder in this country. We've made it difficult to get convictions, and so they have people with rap sheets a mile long who are associated with multiple murders. I'm going to give you a case study on that before we end the program today, so that you know exactly who's going to be released. But what they're saying is that, well, these guys, if they agree to take a meditation class and do yoga 5 times a week, and if they agree to do online training from a federally approved mentorship program, if they do X, Y, and Z, and believe me, there are all kinds of companies lined up who are going to make a killing off of this, right? Because you have to purchase the curriculum, and the inmates have to take the curriculum in order to get out, and then so on and so forth. If they do these things, then we will release them into the public via either free and clear, where they're just done, their sentences are commuted, or if they are maybe a potential flight risk or a threat, we'll let them out of prison, but put them into home confinement or supervised release, or what else do they have here? There was supervised release, home confinement, and halfway houses, right? That's so incredibly dangerous. It's It's absurd, actually, is what it is. You have another comment, question?
Yeah. What was the bill number for the Utah?
All right, this Utah bill was passed about 3 years ago, HB 348. And this bill, make sure you guys read this bill. This is the template bill that will be passed. Remember, Common Core swept through the states. It was cookie cutter education reform. And so this Utah bill is the template for that. And you guys can see that it really is about a lot of traffic laws, but it really is about controlling through the state the local sheriff's department and police department. It's interesting that Daniel Horowitz and a group sent a letter to legislators in Utah just this past year, because does anyone want to take a guess about what happened in Utah after passing Jailbreak 4 years ago? Violent crime has spiked in Utah, and spiked in a significant way. And so people are now questioning.
No way.
Well, I see. It's just it's common sense, right there. So so they work far out. The last thing the ACLU needed to do in order to get the funding from George Soros, $50 million, was build state capacity in early primary and battleground states such as Florida, Iowa, New Hampshire, and Colorado. So that's essentially building political action groups. It's building grassroots support. And again, none of this is real. These are not people. If you guys wonder where the organization that popped up supporting criminal justice reform in your backyard came from, it's not people who really care about this. It's people who have been given money to become activists. And that is the nature of our politics today, is that it's largely driven by these massive foundations, corporations, nonprofits, and NGOs. And just the few that we've mentioned today: George Soros, the Koch brothers, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Bush Family Foundation. Those four organizations, almost wholly responsible, number one, for Common Core, which took over every public school in the U.S. It was a massive takeover by the federal government. And now criminal justice reform, which is an assault on our local police departments and our local sheriff's departments. And so that's how they come together. Notice the unibrow. Did anyone notice the unibrow there? Right? In every case, you have someone from the right, so-called, and someone from the left. This is the unibrow. These entities have allies in Washington, D.C. They have allies in both the leadership of the Republican Party and the leadership of the Democrat Party. And this is why you all have never even thought about massive criminal justice reform, right? But all of a sudden, it's out of nowhere, because they operate in the shadows, they build up fake support, they use fake data, and they use their massive amount of millions and billions. And believe me, they make a ton of money off of this. Notice that Bill Gates is reaping in the revenue as schools try to be Common Core compliant. What are many of them doing across the country? They're getting in Google Chromebooks, right? Because the Google Chromebooks are downloaded with the approved federal curriculum and Common Core. And so your kids are now being surveilled on a daily basis by their Google Chromebook. They are being, the books and the devices are gobbling up an enormous amount of data and information about your child, in addition to the federal standards. And so this is how, if you can see the direct benefit, right? So Bill Gates doesn't do this because he's a philanthropist. George Soros doesn't do this because he cares about the people. They don't. This is a business operation. It's a lobbying operation, and people are, because we are so divided, Democrat, Republican, we can't see it. But we need to understand, this is why it is so important to understand the unibrow. Because unless you can see the unibrow, unless you can go out and criticize your own party, all of us in a very short period of time will experience this federal tyranny. And all of it has to do with breaking apart our local government systems, breaking apart our local state government systems, destroying our ability to earn our own wealth and to be independent, and essentially building a cage around every American in terms of data and surveillance. When you go to the doctor's office, what are they doing? They're clacking on a computer. They're not looking at you anymore. They're collecting data. They're on the computer and they're asking you all sorts of questions that they have no business asking, that they're feeding now to the federal government and to the insurance companies, who the insurance cartel. They're the long arm of the federal government. You might as well call the insurance companies the Department of Health, because that's essentially what is created, monopolies. And so I hope I'm not going over anyone's head right now. Or are people?
Saying, the Zippy crew said I've learned a ton of information this hour.
Really? Mm-hmm. Okay, tell me if I'm going too fast or if you don't understand anything, because sometimes my mind goes really far. But we had a couple more minutes. So I want to leave you with this Daniel Horowitz piece, and it's entitled "This Is Who." The Criminal Justice Reform Advocates. And by the way, this is the First Step Act. This is the last lump of coal that they're going to put in the legislative stocking for us this Christmas season. And it is criminal justice reform. And Daniel Horowitz has provided us with a case study. He said, like good liberals, the pseudo-conservatives supporting criminal justice reform trot out sob stories about the guy who did nothing but take a whiff of marijuana and was suddenly locked up in a federal prison for life, right? It's like the poor kid selling dime bags out of his mom's basement, right? This is the guy who never did anything violent ever. He's a really great kid. No. And you guys remember Alice Marie Johnson. This was the woman who was trotted out by Jared Kushner and Kanye and Kim Kardashian. It was actually Kim Kardashian. And she was the woman, she was an elderly grandmother, and she had grandchildren, and she just got wrapped up with the wrong people for a short amount of time, back in the day. Turns out she was like a major kingpin in a massive cocaine operation. It was a massive cocaine ring. She was convicted on money laundering, conspiracy, possession, multiple counts. I mean, she was raking in the cash, hand over fist. So this is not the idea that she's just an elderly grandmother and like someone slipped a bag of pot in her back pocket and she didn't really even know, and she just, by accident transported it somewhere. That's just a false narrative. And in addition, Mike Lee wrote an op-ed featuring Weldon Angelos, who was in his piece called A Conservative Case for Criminal Justice Reform. It turns out Weldon Angelos was also a hardened criminal connected to major Latin drug rings in Southern California. So Daniel decided, well, if they're going to give out fake sob stories about people who are in the criminal justice system, then I'll give you guys a story about someone real. And this is the type of person, I'm sorry, my throat is scratchy, hold on. This is the type of person that is going to be released if the First Step Act passes. And I mentioned a piece yesterday in ABC News. This bill is getting a lot of pushback, and they weren't expecting to get so much pushback. They weren't expecting people to actually read the bill, but we had the opportunity to kill it. And I hope that this audience will be the tip of the spear, because this isn't over. But according to Daniel, if you want stories that more accurately depict who federal prosecutors target for long sentences, here is your man, Sergio M. Robles, a.k.a. Chico. All right, so let's meet Chico. This is an article from Tuesday at the Chicago Tribune, and it reads, gang member tied to 2 murders sentenced to 27 years. So you're probably wondering, 27 years for 2 murders. It seems light, right? It seems like how possibly could you only get 27 years for 2 murders? Why not life imprisonment? Why not the death penalty? The reality is that he wasn't convicted on murder charges, right? He was convicted on drug charges in RICO. Thus, this is the type of case where agitators could come several years from now and declare outrage over locking someone up for 25 years on a RICO drug charge. But in reality, he was only targeted because he was a Latina Kings gang leader responsible for much of the murder and mayhem spilling over from Chicago into northern Indiana. The stiff sentencing allows prosecutors to get him off the streets. Obviously, those who only commit RICO and drug trafficking aren't sentenced this long. Just last week, a major Latina Nations gang member in Chicago was convicted on drug trafficking and 17 firearm charges, yet he was still only sentenced to 9 years. Why? At the end of the day, there was no murder. In terms of it's not Chico, it's Checo. In terms of Checo, who was sentenced to 27 years, the reason he was sentenced to 27 years is because he's a gang leader and he's responsible for murders. Here is the synopsis of the case from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Ready? At sentencing, Robles, this is AKA Checo, was responsible for participating in the December 2003 murder of Jonathan Zimmerman in Hammond, Indiana, and the May 2008 murder of Jose Cortez in East Chicago. The Latina Kings suspected Zimmerman was involved in a drug transaction with counterfeit currency. Accordingly, Zimmerman was shot and killed by a co-defendant. Jose Cortez was shot to death by another co-defendant because the Latina Kings believed Cortez was a member of a rival street gang. According to documents in the case, Robles possessed a firearm in furtherance of the gang's activities and was involved in a conspiracy to distribute 150 kilograms of cocaine and 1,000 kilograms of marijuana. Okay, so these are not your neighborhood drug dealer, right? This is not the guy in his mom's basement. People with short memories forget that Reagan's federal sentencing policies led to a 70% decline in violent crime and homicide in the following decade. All of these gangbangers engaging in firearms and drug trafficking were committing most of the murder, armed robbery, and aggravated assault. By having stiff sentencing for those crimes, which were easy to prove, prosecutors were able to deter or remove the violent criminals from the streets when it would otherwise be tough to land convictions on the more violent crimes. The point is, this bill, the First Step Act, which addresses federal prison populations in the U.S., falsely claims that this is to address non-violent, white-collar felons in the U.S., and it's absolutely false. I would encourage all of you to go to Conservative Review. Make sure that you are following me on Twitter, following me on Facebook, because I will continue to put out information. But there are a lot of local law enforcement groups, local sheriff's associations, state and national sheriff's associations, also the Justice Department, a whole slew of union workers and those who work in federal prisons, but also local prisons, who are shouting from the hilltops that this is a disaster. This will unleash violent criminals onto unsuspecting American population. And in many cases, you know, it's interesting, a lot of these folks who are going to be released are illegal aliens, right? So you would think at least they could just deport them. Why not release them? Why don't you just deport them back to wherever it is that they came from? But see, the Republicans won't even do that. In fact, we're talking about amnesty at the end of the year. Whew, that was a heavy program. My programs are not always that heavy, guys. It's one of the reasons that I wanted to get this off my chest is because I have not really been doing politics for, you know, over a week now. And so this is so important and it's so timely, and your voices are more important than ever. So if you guys want to push this out to everyone you know via Facebook, via Twitter, and also you guys right now, we are 100%. Wait, questions, Courtney. Do we have questions, comments? What are people saying?
No, that's some serious weight.
Yeah,
crew.
Yeah. I know. My shows are not always this weighty. I'm still getting my sea legs.
And thank you for sharing. Knowledge is powerful. Keep moving forward. Great work.
All right. Okay. Awesome.
And that's
I would love feedback from you guys, so make sure you reach out to me on any of my media platforms. And again, this broadcast will only get better, right? We are bootleg right now. I have, you know, the Xbox One headphones that we're using, and you know, it really is a makeshift studio, but this is going to get better and better, and your support is just so necessary. If you guys appreciate what we're doing and you in your heart feel like a donation would make sense, I want to encourage you to go to theshannonjoy.com and just click on the top right hand corner and give in any amount. If you like what we're doing, you'd like to see it to continue, we appreciate. Right now we are subsisting 100% on subscriptions and donations. And for those of you who are subscribers, I know that we're keeping up the YouTube video feeds right now, but they are going to go away. So eventually, I'm thinking next week, as soon as we can start pushing these out on social media, as soon as this live broadcast is over, we're taking it down and we're putting it behind the paywall on theshannonjoy.com so that you those of you who are subscribing to the podcasts get the benefit of that on-demand listening and that content. We want to make sure that you have a reason to subscribe, and that is going to be the primary reason. So you guys, again, thank you so much for all of your support. Thank you for watching today. Again, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Lots of exciting things happening, so I hope to bring you guys some really good news soon. But onward and upward. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.